When the Spanish arrived in the New World, what is now known as the Valley of Mexico was one of the most densely populated areas in the entire world. An estimated 1 million people living specifically in a highland plateau surrounded on all sides by mountains and volcanoes, where even the lowest point in the basin was still about 7,200 feet above sea level. At that time, the valley contained 5 interconnected lakes, the largest of which covered about 580 miles of the valley. As these lakes had no natural outlet for water, it was a mix of salt water and fresh water, creating a unique and isolated ecosystem. The valley had been inhabited for at least 12,000 years, and several powerful civilizations had risen up and fallen, controlling the area at various points. These were not just large and powerful civilizations by North American standards. At its height between 100 BC and 500 AD, the city of Teotihuacan was likely the 6th largest city in the world, with an estimated 125,000 people living within an 8-mile square radius. But most of the time, the structure was a series of city-states, interconnected but not under one domain. Despite not having access to large domesticatable animals such as horse and oxen, the people of the region were still able to build huge cities and elaborate structures such as the enormous pyramids that remain to this day. Each of these cities, largely functioning as city-states, would engage in trade with each other, often long-distance trade. The cities of the Mexico Valley were particularly well known for producing obsidian tools and weapons, thanks to their proximity to the volcanic stone deposits. These tools and weapons were exported and found around what is now Mexico and Central America, despite the fact that horses and similar pack animals did not exist in America prior to European arrival. The Aztec Empire, which the Spanish first encountered, was relatively new. They called themselves the Mexica, many living in the city that built on a raised island in the middle of the lake in the Mexico Valley they called Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan had not always been the most powerful city in the area. Previously, they had to pay tribute to Azcapotzalco, also in the Mexico Valley. The group that had founded Tenochtitlan had actually only come to the Mexico Valley approximately 200 years prior in the mid-1200s. They were reportedly members of a nomadic tribe from the north known as the Mexica. This group attempted first to build a settlement on the edge of the lake, only to be attacked, and then later built an artificial island that was more defensible, that became Tenochtitlan. As Tenochtitlan grew and became more powerful, more of the Mexico people began to come to the area, and 2 other city-states were created, Texcoco and Xocloplan. This became known as the Triple Alliance. Through political marriages and increases in military, these 3 city-states ceased to pay tribute and began to collect it. By 1428, the empire was able to exert considerable control over the entire Mexico Valley as well as the surrounding area. They forced other city-states to pay them tribute. This tribute system was continuing around the same time that Columbus arrived in 1492, but being able to force someone to pay you tribute does not make them loyal to you. It took about 30 years from the time of Columbus's first voyage to the New World before the Spanish were able to establish enough of a foothold in the Caribbean holdings to seriously consider expanding to the mainland. Initially, Columbus was given broad authority as to how he wanted to govern the New World, but within the first decade, that authority was taken from him. It was ostensibly based on the allegations he was abusing both the native people and the Spanish that were sent to the islands, but more realistically, it was to give the power to those loyal to the crown and church. It was during this transitory period that Hernan Cortes arrived as an 18-year-old in 1504. He took part in taking military control over the island Hispaniola, and later Cuba in 1511. Cortes initially worked for and impressed the first governor of Cuba, and as a result he was able to gain political power and wealth. The governor had planned for Cortes to lead an expedition to explore what is now Mexico, but then their relationship became strained, and he rescinded that order just before Cortes was scheduled to leave. Cortes ignored the rescission order and took the expedition to the mainland in open defiance of the governor. Cortes arrived on the mainland around 1519 and met a Franciscan priest by the name of Guillermo de Aguilar. Aguilar had been shipwrecked on the mainland and was captured by Mayan people in the area, and during his time in captivity he had learned enough of the language to act as somewhat of a translator. The Aztec were not only still dominant, but arguably at their peak of expansion. But that also meant they were at their peak in terms of enemies looking to push back against that expansion. Cortes' small force was able to establish a foothold near what is now the Tabasco region of southern Mexico. The group had taken control of a small fortification, but then were attacked on all sides. The Spanish were able to hold despite being relatively few in number, thanks to having cannons and horses, something that had never been seen before against those who were fighting against. A Spanish soldier by the name of Bernal Diaz del Castillo described the battle by saying, quote, "They brought great plumes, drums, and small trumpets. Their faces were red with ochre, pale and dark. They had great bows and arrows and spears and bucklers, and they were in such large squads that all the savannah was covered. They came furiously and surrounded us on all sides. The first attack wounded more than 70 of us, and there were 300 Indians for each one of us. And being in this, we saw how the cavalry came from behind them, and we trapped them with them on one side and we on the other. And the Indians believed that the horse and the rider were one as they had never seen horses before." The peoples the Spanish had held off were a group of Mayans, and they sent ambassadors. The delegation brought gifts, as was the tradition for the losing side of any battle in their culture, as a way of making the peace. These gifts included not just gold and valuable trade goods, but 20 young women as slaves. One of these young girls was likely the daughter of a noble who'd been slain when she was a preteen. Her actual name seems to vary from account to account, either Marina, Malinche, but she's often referred to as La Malinche. What all accounts agree on was that she was incredibly skilled at learning languages. When ambassadors from the Aztec came to investigate the Spanish settlement, Aguirre was unable to speak their language, but La Malinche could, as well as several other dialects. As she quickly began to learn Spanish to do translation, Cortes promised her, quote, more than liberty if she would act as his translator going forward. So important were his services that Cortes reportedly said of her, quote, after God, Marina was the main reason for his success. Marina also became the mother of Cortes's firstborn son, Martin, in 1522. This was probably quite awkward for Cortes, as he was married at the time to a relative of the governor of Cuba for whom he defied. That same year his son was born, his wife arrived to reconnect with him. She died that same year under suspicious circumstances. Servants reported that Cortes and his wife had been fighting before they went to bed, and this was a frequent occurrence since her arrival. Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote, quote, 3 months after her arrival, we heard they had found her dead of asthma one night, and that they had a banquet the day before, and in the evening, and a very big party. But because I do not know then what I have said, I will not touch on this subject. Cortes never married the Mayan translator, and it's unclear if their relationship was consensual. Marina later married a Spanish nobleman with whom she had another child, and Cortes married a Spanish noblewoman, but Cortes did legitimize the child in 1529. In just a few short years, Cortes was able to use his translator to convince the enemies of the Aztec state to join with him to invade and take control of the capital. So resented with the Aztec and Aztecs' rule that it's estimated between 150 and 200,000 allies may have joined Cortes's forces on their attack. Without these alliances, even with cannons and horses, Cortes's small force would never have been able to topple the Aztecs. After defeating the Aztecs, likely to assert his claim over the throne, Cortes had another child with Isabel Montezuma, a daughter of the Aztec ruler his forces had defeated, and whose husband Cortes himself had killed. Isabel's refusal to recognize this child seems a strong indication that his actions were not consensual. Depending on the count, you'll either see credit or condemnation for the young Mayan woman who acted as translator. It is said by both Spanish and native accounts that she was often able to convince groups to surrender without a fight by convincing the leaders of the inevitability of Spanish military victory. Their leaders likely believing the outcome would be similar to a tribute model as had come before from distant city-state empires and not realizing the true horror. But what none of them could have known was that the diseases brought by Europeans were equally effective against ally or enemy. Only Europeans had any kind of real immunity, and so it spread through the warriors and trade networks that had been built over the centuries. With the Aztecs defeated, and any other potential rivals in the area decimated by mass casualties brought by New World diseases, the Spanish were able to more or less take over already existing infrastructure. Spanish immigrants coming to the New World weren't so much building cities as repopulating them. Cortes declared the region New Spain on August 18, 1521. These new settlers also had access to New World domesticated animals such as the horse and the ox, and these pack animals helped expedite the acquisition of what had already been gathered and mined by all of the prior empires. The amount of wealth that would now be able to send back to Spain exploded. But again, Cortes did all of this without the approval of his own governor, let alone the Spanish crown. He was constantly making deals and treaties with the various factions more or less on his own, and as news got back to Spain that there were great concerns that Cortes and the other conquistadors might try to create their own new empire. And these concerns were probably quite reasonable. In 1521, the crown sent an inspector to investigate Cortes's actions and, if appropriate, arrest him for disobeying the order of the Cuban governor. When the inspector arrived, those there refused to acknowledge his authority from the crown and seemed to have convinced him to return to the Spanish holdings in Santo Domingo and affirm Cortes with a substantial bribe in Aztec gold. By 1524, Cortes had founded several cities in New Spain and given land grants to his most loyal men. This was through what was called the Encomienda system. The Encomienda system stemmed from a Spanish word meaning to entrust. It was developed in Spain as the Spanish fought wars to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Islamic rule. It was also implemented in the Caribbean for similar purposes in acquiring land from the native people there. It was very similar to the feudal system, with the idea being it would reward those who conquered territory with the wealth and resources of the land they conquered, including the work and the taxes of the people who lived there, so long as everything still belonged to the crown. It specifically outlined rules around extracting taxes and tribute from non-Christians in conquered areas versus Christians. And in some ways, this system was not that dissimilar to what the natives had been living in under the Aztec tribute system, which is perhaps why they were able to negotiate peace rather than fight so often, believing it was more or less swapping one tribute state for another, rather than the radical change that actually was on its way. But of course, as Cortes was giving out of these land grants, it was with more or less no consultation with the crown. Spain had claimed through the Catholic Church and the Treaty of Tordesillas to all of the New World west of the Cape Verde Islands, which included about half of North America and the majority of South America. But claims were only claims until they were enforced by occupation. Expansion to the north was hindered by a large stretch of desert which was lightly populated generally, but even more so lightly populated currently following a drought that predated Spanish arrival. And prior to the Panama Canal, any ship leaving Spain trying to reach the northwest coast would have to sail all the way around South America and back up past far more easily accessible and potentially valuable land. And so the focus for expansion went south. It was with all this occurring that Cortes had an internal war with a fellow Spaniard, as he started an expedition into what is now Honduras. He picked someone who he believed to be loyal, someone who had fought with him against the Aztecs, by the name of Cristobal de Olid. But Olid then declared his independence from New Spain, reportedly at the suggestion of Cortes's rival, the governor of Cuba. All of this chaos and infighting led the King of Spain, Charles V, to believe he had to intervene. He sent a man by the name of Luis Ponce de Leon, not to be confused with Juan Ponce de Leon of Fountain of Youth fame, to investigate Cortes, also giving de Leon the power to arrest Cortes if appropriate. On his arrival, Luis suspended Cortes's power. However, he had reportedly fallen ill early in the voyage, so he deferred the power to his assistant just 4 days before he died. His assistant soon also became ill and died a short time later. While both men were older, it is very possible the deaths were of natural causes. Suspicions were that Cortes had poisoned and murdered both of them. Because of these suspicions, Cortes was not permitted to become governor, and a third person, Alonso de Estrada, was selected. Alonso was likely a bastard son of the late King Ferdinand II of Aragon, and had been sent over with a group to act as a judge for the royal authority in the region, possibly over the trial of Cortes himself. Estrada, who most accounts agree was himself quite corrupt, eventually exiled Cortes, leading Cortes to sail to Spain in 1528 to attempt to appeal directly to Charles V. Cortes was actually well received at the court, as they became aware of how much wealth he had actually brought to them with the conquest. He was granted a title which made him the Marquis of one of the wealthiest regions of New Spain, but he was not given it back any other political power. In 1535, the Spanish crown selected Antonio de Mendoza to serve as the first viceroy for New Spain, a role he held for 15 years. Another model that was replicated from the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula was that the Catholic Church were, for all intents and purposes, a branch of the Spanish government. They were focused on conversion of the indigenous people in the area, along with purges of anyone who were unwilling, in the tradition of the Spanish Inquisition, which at that time was still ongoing. Still, this was in many ways an improvement over what had come before in terms of violence and dehumanization by the likes of Cortes and Columbus. Bartolome de Casas famously wrote of the atrocities inflicted on indigenous people by saying, quote, "The reason the Christians have murdered on such a vast scale and killed anyone and everyone in their way is purely and simply greed. Their insatiable greed and overweening ambition knows no bounds. The land is fertile and rich, the inhabitants simple, forbearing, and submissive. The Spaniards have shown not the slightest consideration for these people, treating them, and I speak from first-hand experience having been there from the outset, not as brute animals. Indeed, I would to God that they had done and shown them the consideration they afford their animals, so much as piles of dung in the middle of the road. They have had as little concern for their souls as for their bodies. All the millions that perished having gone to their deaths with no knowledge of God and without the benefit of the sacraments. One fact in all of this is widely known and beyond dispute, for even the tyrannical murderers themselves acknowledge the truth of it. The indigenous people never did the Europeans any harm whatever. On the contrary, they believed them to have descended from the heavens, at least until they and their fellow citizens had tasted, at the hands of these oppressors, a diet of robbery, murder, violence, and all other manners of trial and tribulations. Likely as a result of these reports of abuse, the Spanish crown passed new laws in 1542 to provide some protections to the native people. But laws are only useful if they can be enforced, and the Spanish crown was far too distant from New Spain to do so. While the law in word made enslaving native people illegal and called for a gradual end to the Encomienda system, in practice there was no substantial enforcement. It had already been in theory illegal to enslave native people in the Spanish territory since 1501, when Queen Isabella declared them subjects to the crown, but as before the law was simply ignored as no one was willing or able to enforce it. As a result, joining the Catholic Church as a path to assimilation was more or less the only escape from the brutality, again following the same style of ethnic cleansing used by Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. And as evil as it is to provide only a false choice to avoid a life of perpetual enslavement, I would point out that this was quite different than the path taken by American settlers, who provided arguably the same level of brutality with no path to assimilation. But that's another video. While the Spanish claimed much of what is now the American Southwest, the settlement there was sparse in the early going. The Spanish claimed most of what is now Alabama, Arizona, the Carolinas, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, New Mexico, Texas, and California, but actual Spanish colonies in what is now the United States were more focused in the South, specifically South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. In 1559, the Spanish set up a settlement near what is now Pensacola, but St. Augustine wasn't founded until 1565, making it the oldest European city in any current U.S. state. But the Spanish focus pushed them more south, where they were able to colonize more easily by conquering existing cities and settlements, rather than having to establish new ones. Around 1598, there was some attempt to expand into the American Southwest by missionaries, and by 1610 the Spanish had pushed into what is now New Mexico, founding Santa Fe. But even then, further expansion into South America was the focus, and any interest in setting up a West Coast trade to perhaps provide a connection to the Far East was mitigated by Spain's recent conquest of the Philippines in 1565. The Philippines gave them an even closer connection that tended to run through ports in the south that were already established in the Mexico City region. Starting in 1629, a few missions were built in Arizona in attempts to convert the Hopi people living there, but by 1680, there was an uprising by the Pueblo people in the region who rejected the assimilation. Some have argued this revolt, and with it the capture of a large number of horses from the fleeing Spaniards, was a catalyst for the creation of the Native American horse culture that followed in the coming century, but based on genetic and archaeological evidence, it's likely this only enhanced the already growing shift. Spain only returned and attempted to reclaim the area in 1692 to ensure a buffer against the French expansion, as the French had laid claim to much of the Mississippi Valley region down to what is now Louisiana, and were pressing into what is now Texas. It was during this time that Spain began establishing mission settlements in West Texas along the Gulf Coast, and began to solidify claims made by the Spanish all the way back in 1519 that had only been lightly enforced. In 1650, the Spanish built the Mission de San Francisco de la Espada, near what is now Wichita, Texas, and they appointed a governor for Texas in 1691. But just a few years later, in 1693, the mission was forced to bury their mission bell to protect it from theft, set the mission on fire, and retreat to Mexico out of fear that the native groups would rise up against them, following a drought and a smallpox epidemic. It wasn't until 1716 that mission was reestablished far to the southwest in what is now San Antonio. It was during this time that the Spanish began referring to a large northeastern area that included some of Texas as New Philippines, in the hopes that they would find the same amount of success there that they had found in the Philippines. But eventually the area became known generally as Texas, named after what the Spanish called the native people of the area. And while the Spanish pushed to set up a number of missions and settlements in the area, they had difficulty convincing settlers to actually go to Texas. It was relatively lightly populated, and the Apache and Comanche would often attack anyone traveling between the fortified settlements. And setting up most businesses in the colonies was quite difficult, as Spain discouraged any kind of industrialization for fear it would create competition with Spain itself. It preferred the colonies focus on gathering natural resources. Even more restricting, the colonies were more or less only allowed to trade with Spain directly, discouraging any kind of outside investment or attempts to grow outside of Spanish capacity. Ironically, the vast surge of silver wealth in the New World also had created hyperinflation and enormous wealth disparity in Spain, with high rents and costs forcing many out of the urban areas. And even within Spain, where industrial production was not discouraged, it was simply less profitable than simply doing raw material expeditions in the New World and then selling the raw materials to others who had produced goods. Spain being so dependent on the collection and sale of natural resources meant their wealth streams were very inconsistent. This often led Spanish rulers to overreach and have to go into debt. And while other countries like England and the Netherlands were also going into debt, they were using that debt to build infrastructure. Spain, on the other hand, tended to neglect internal infrastructure projects, not just in the New World, but in Spain itself. In addition, they had a huge cost in terms of defense, often being victims to piracy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 effectively ended Spanish dominance of the seas, and over time the Spanish mindset shifted from expansion and growth to simply trying to hold on. As a result, there was no real appetite to attempt to colonize the west coast of America, even if they had legal claim to it. More land that was a burden to hold and maintain rather than benefit, particularly when indigenous rebellion in the existing areas needed to be dealt with, both in the New World and in Europe, as Protestant and Catholic wars continued, and the Habsburg kings were not only rulers of Spain, but also the Holy Roman Empire. When King Charles II died, it was unclear who would succeed him. Charles had named a grandson of the French King Louis XIV, but the Archduke of Austria contested the claim and was backed by the English and the Dutch. In the end, the French Bourbon family emerged, along with close French alliances. These alliances came into play during the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in America. Spain acquired what later became the Louisiana Territory from France by way of a secret treaty, but they then had to deal with rebellions by the native French. But during that same war, the British were able to capture Havana in 1762, which was at the time Spain's primary Caribbean port. So important was Havana that Spain conceded all of Florida in exchange for its return. This led Spain to start the process of trying to create a standing army in New Spain in 1764 to protect its interests. In 1765, Jose de Galvez was sent to New Spain as an inspector general to find out what had happened to what was once the dominant power of the New World. What he found was that corruption was rampant and there was almost no long-term planning. He found that despite having access to vast resources and being in control of the area for over 200 years, it was far from prosperous. He implemented reforms that increased control by the Spanish crown, including creating a state monopoly on tobacco and new taxes on flour and agave wine. In 1767, in order to increase crown control, King Carlos III decreed all Jesuit priests were ordered to be expelled as part of the reforms. About 75% of those who were expelled were born in the New World, and their expulsion included the taking of their land back by the crown, who would then resell it. While some protests occurred, they were quickly repressed. Jesuit priests in New Spain had focused largely on educating wealthy and well-connected men born in the New World rather than conversions of native groups. The Franciscans who replaced them, on the other hand, were largely focused on evangelism. This dramatically changed the northern sections of New Spain known as Alta California. While the coast of California had been explored and had small settlements, it wasn't until this transition that there was significant outreach into the interior. In fact, it wasn't until 1769 that there was any formal expedition by Europeans to explore the area that is now California, beyond the coast. That first expedition was led by a man by the name of Gaspar de Portoya, who was the governor overseeing what is now California. He went from what is now San Diego all the way up to what is now San Francisco, and at the time there were an estimated between 133,000 to 705,000 indigenous people living in the whole of California. The expedition reported that they were friendly and helpful to the expedition, even bringing them food at one point. More expeditions followed, many with the intent of building missions and proselytizing the native people, but others simply looking to take advantage of the new options available. One such group became known as the Los Angeles Pobladores. They set up a settlement in the area that is now Los Angeles, and the group was made up of 44 people, half adults and half children. Only one person in the group was actually born in Spain, the leader of the group, Felipe de Neve. 9 were indigenous, 8 were of a mix black and Spanish, 2 were black, and 1 was a mix of Spanish and Native American. But as happened every time Europeans reached areas where Native Americans hadn't been encountered before, death and disease followed. Some Native Americans did come to the missions seeking goods and help, but once they were baptized, they weren't allowed to leave. Those who didn't come willingly were often brought by force, as disease ravaged them to the point they couldn't defend themselves. A Scottish man named Hugo Reid visited the missions and reported, quote, "They went as far as present Rancho de Chino, where they tied and whipped every man, woman, and child in the lodge, and drove part of them back. On the road, they did the same with those of the lodge of San Jose. On arriving home, the men were instructed to throw their bows and arrows at the feet of the priest, and make due submission. The infants were then baptized, as were all the children under 8 years of age. The former were left with their mothers, the latter kept apart from all communication with their parents. The consequence was, first, the women consented to the rite and received it, for the love they bore their children, and finally the males gave way for purpose of enjoying once more the society of wife and family. Marriage was then performed, and so this contaminated race, in their own sight and that of their kindred, became followers of Christ." Records indicate the majority of Native American children who were baptized didn't reach adulthood, with one mission showing 3 out of 4 children never made it to the age of 2. They mostly died of diseases for which they had no natural immunity, such as the measles. Young unmarried indigenous women were required to live in nunneries and could not leave until married, with courtship conducted through barred windows. Throughout the entire period, at least 90,000 indigenous people were kept in mission compounds, where they were treated more or less as slave labor to support the missions. The labor requirement could be anything from farming to producing goods to sell for the mission to make profits. Some were even sent to local forts to work as servants. Most acts of disobedience would lead to whippings. It was also during this time that it was found that California's climate was ideal for some European plants, such as citrus fruit and wine, although the economic value of this reality was not discovered until much later. The high death rates for natives made it difficult for missions to maintain population, leading to sometimes extreme actions by the priest. One historian by the name of Antonia Castaneda wrote, quote, "Father Olbes at Mission Santa Cruz ordered an infertile couple to have sexual intercourse in his presence because he did not believe they could not have children. The couple refused, but Olbes forcibly inspected the man's penis to learn, quote, whether or not it was in good order, and tried to inspect the woman's genitalia. She refused, fought with him, and tried to bite him. Olbes ordered she be tied by the hands and given 50 lashes, shackled and locked up in the woman's dormitory. He then had a monogote made, and commanded that she treat the doll as it were child and carry it in the presence of everyone for 9 days. While the woman was beaten and her sexuality demeaned, the husband, who had been intimate with another woman was ridiculed and humiliated. Native women were frequent victims of sexual assault and involuntary pregnancy. If they attempted to end the pregnancy, they could be beaten, chained in irons, shaved, and it was stipulated that they would stand in front of the altar at Mass next to a decorated wooden newborn as punishment. Spain entered the Revolutionary War in 1779 on the side of the colonists, more due to conflict with England and a desire to reclaim Florida than any alliance to future America. Spain was able to regain Florida at the Treaty of Paris in exchange for the Bahamas. The west coast above San Francisco remained in dispute with England, Russia and Spain all making claims as well, but none having substantial enough settlement to really contest it. Spain's close ties to the French monarchy ended when the French monarchy ended, with the death of Louis XVI. With Louis's execution, like most of Europe, Spain found itself at war with France. But by 1801, they were willing to make deals with Napoleon. Specifically, Spain agreed to return the Louisiana territory it had acquired 39 years prior, in exchange for land in what is now the Tuscany region of Italy. But just because they could make treaties didn't mean they couldn't go to war later. In 1808, Napoleon forced Spanish rulers to abdicate the throne, and a war for control of the Iberian Peninsula ensued. With the Spanish crown unable to even hold on to the Spanish mainland, its overseas control began to be openly challenged by local powers. A man by the name of Miguel Hidalgo de Castilla began his studies with Jesuit priests prior to their expulsion. After their expulsion, he continued his studies, becoming a priest in 1770, but by the early 1800s, he was more a secular priest. He declined to take a vow of poverty and owned several businesses, and he declined to take a vow of celibacy, having several children with several women. His teachings questioned the power of the Pope, the virgin birth, and the need for clerical celibacy. This at one point had led him to being called before the Mexican Inquisition, but he was found not guilty. When a drought hit his hometown, he and others began to plan a coup. Fearing that the plot had been discovered, around 2:30 in the morning, Hidalgo had the church bell rung and called his congregation to give a speech that came to be known as the Cry of Dolores. While the exact words of the speech have been lost to time, most agree the message and the sentiment was a call to reject the monarchy and the social hierarchy of the time, calling for the lower and middle classes to rise and revolt against the elite. While this message tapped into widespread discontent with Spain, there were few clear shared goals as to what would come next. His second-in-command would later say of the uprising, quote, "Neither were his men amenable to discipline, nor was Hidalgo interested in regulations." Roughly 800 men on horseback left Dolores and rode through the area gathering support to eventually march on Mexico City. They reached an estimated 100,000 supporters when they were on the edge of Mexico City, and would likely have won a decisive battle. But Hidalgo decided to not take his forces into the city, leading many to desert. Eventually he and his men were captured and executed. On the day of his execution, Hidalgo thanked his jailers for treating him well, and said, quote, "Though I may die, I shall be remembered forever, and you all soon will be forgotten." The revolution became more of a guerrilla war for some time, fighting a stalemate, and in this context, Spain found that after acquiring Florida again, it was more of a burden than benefit for them to administer. They ceded Florida to the United States rather than trying to defend it in 1819. In 1820, there was a military coup in Spain that overthrew the crown. This further demoralized the royalist forces in Mexico, and many rejected the coup leaders and joined with the independence movement. One of the leaders of the royalists, Agustin de Iturbide, was able to take over Mexico, becoming emperor for a time starting in 1821, before he was overthrown by a coup in 1823. Officials met that year to write a constitution, which was eventually modeled after the United States Constitution, creating a federal system. The document was completed and published on October 4th, 1824, and a week later elections were held. Guadalupe Victoria, a war hero, won, becoming the first president of the new Mexican Republic. In an effort to grow their population, Mexico passed a colonization law in 1824. This law allowed each Mexican state to decide how they wanted to allow foreigners to come in and claim unsettled land. And this was used widely in places like Texas and California as a way to create settlements large enough to sustain and defend themselves. But the law required this land had to be at least 26 miles from the coast. This created both incentive and tension, as the most valuable land was coastal, and many of the settlers were already occupying land less than 26 miles from the coast, particularly around Galveston Bay in Texas. Financial problems also started almost immediately with the new government, as they were still defending themselves against attempts by Spain to recolonize as late as the Battle of Tampico in 1829. With few sources of revenue, the leadership had to take out loans from a British banking house in order to fund the government. However, that banking house failed in 1827, leading to a financial crisis. Additionally, Spain's ongoing attempts to recolonize led to concerns about native Spaniards still living in Mexico. Many called for them to be expelled, but this was in direct contradiction to the values of equality in the new constitution, and the new laws encouraging settlement generally. When President Victoria refused, there was a brief attempt at insurrection led by his vice president Nicola Bravo, but Bravo failed and found himself exiled. But this was additional evidence of the weakness of the new government. After elections were held in 1828, violence broke out when the supporters of the losing candidate, Vicente Guerrero, refused to accept the results. The winner of the election, Gomez Pedraza, attempted to use the violence to justify arresting and prosecuting the opposition, but this led to a popular uprising in the capital, causing the president to have to flee the country, and ironically allowing Guerrero to take power. Guerrero was a mixed-race populist leader who embraced his native Mexican heritage so much that his supporters would often link him to Aztec rulers. In his inaugural address, he said, quote, "The representatives are to be found in all classes of the people, and the true titles of superiority, the only ones that cause distinction and preference, are discovered wherever talent and virtue appear." He said his administration, quote, "is obliged to procure the widest possible benefit and apply them from the palace of the rich to the wooden shack of the humble laborer." He abolished slavery, which at the time was only practiced in one Mexican province, Texas. The future leader of the Texas Revolution, Stephen F. Austin, wrote in response, quote, "I am the owner of one slave only, an old decrepit woman, not worth much. But in this matter, I should feel that my constitutional rights as a Mexican were just as much infringed as they would if I had 1,000. His government also passed federal taxes to address the debt and raise funds, but these taxes were more or less universally ignored by all of the various states. His vice president, Anastasio Bustamante, organized a coup against Guerrero by uniting his opposition and installed himself as president in February of 1830. This new government outlawed further American expansion into Texas, where American settlers had been moving, and sent forces to Texas to build a series of forts to prevent further incursions by American settlers and deter the growing separatist movement there. But when Bustamante went beyond just removing Guerrero from power and had the former president arrested, court-martialed, and then executed in January of 1831, even most of his supporters believed he went too far. They called on a leader by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to remove Bustamante from office. When Bustamante was removed, the presidency reverted back to the man who Guerrero himself had usurped, Manuel Gomez Pedraza. Pedraza finished out the final 3 months of the term, and the next set of elections, Santa Anna won. It seems Santa Anna himself was not that interested in governing, leaving most of the authority to his vice president while he lived on a coastal estate, but the vice president engaged in a series of unpopular moves. He attempted to reduce the size of the military, and he passed a series of anti-church measures which closed all church schools, including the Mexico City University. This led for calls for his removal, particularly among church leaders. Santa Anna was convinced to return and did force his vice president to resign, but he also dissolved the national congresses and replaced them with loyalists. He then called for new elections and returned to retirement. In 1835, a new constitution was drafted, creating the centralist government of Mexico. Amid all of this, in the early 1830s, the Mexican army had loaned a cannon to the citizens of Gonzales, Texas. This cannon was intended for protection from raids by native groups in the area. Texans had long-standing grievances over government's failure to protect them from Native American attacks, and many new settlers had little loyalty to the new country. In 1832, a group of Mexican citizens in Texas held a convention to meet with the Mexican officials to address grievances, and some compromises were made, but unrest continued. As tensions rose between the military and settlers in the area, the Mexican army sent men to retrieve the cannon in 1835 lest it be used against them. The settlers declined to return the cannon. The Mexican army sent a larger force of 100 men to retrieve the cannon. They were met by around 140 Texas militiamen, who raised a large banner with a drawing of the cannon, and on it the words, "Come and take it." In the skirmish that followed, 2 Mexican soldiers were killed and 1 Texan was injured. Outnumbered by the settlers, the Mexican army was forced to retreat. Seizing on the victory, Texas secessionists sent forces to capture 2 nearby forts that were undermanned, and were able to do so without even a shot being fired. On November 3rd, 58 of the 98 elected Texas delegates convened and voted in a provisional government based on the 1824 Mexican Constitution that had been recently replaced. As Texas at the time lacked the population to be granted full Mexican statehood, they stated they would not agree to return to Mexico under the new Constitution, believing the new Constitution lacked any checks and balances. At that time, there was only a population of roughly 30,000 residents, but they declared themselves the Republic of Texas. On November 13th, they voted to create an army with Sam Houston named as the commander-in-chief, and in an effort to attract soldiers from the United States, they promised land grants to soldiers who joined, signaling the goal was independence, not reform. But there was still internal debate as to whether this was a fight for independence or reform. Austin wrote in 1830 that he would also oppose joining the United States if they, quote, insist on the perpetual exclusion of slavery from this state. He went on to say, quote, Texas must be a slave country. Circumstances and unavoidable necessity compel it. It is the wish of the people there, and it is my duty to do all I can prudently in favor of it. I will do so. As the Texas Republic had no funding mechanism, the new Texas Army was given the permission to confiscate what it needed. This was understandably unpopular, particularly in areas where the troops were doing the confiscation. One Texas paper wrote, quote, some are not willing under the present government to do any duty. That our government is bad, all acknowledge, and no one will deny. The Texas Army began seizing the lately defended fortifications along the Gulf Coast, and eventually took control of a mission that had been converted into a fort in San Antonio that became known as the Alamo. Santa Anna personally came out of retirement to lead an expedition to put down the rebellion, but as was the case with more or less everything else involving the early Mexican state, resources were insufficient and planning poor. Possibly not understanding the climate variations of South Texas, his men were ill-prepared for the cold in addition to lacking sufficient food and supplies. He was still able to recapture San Antonio and the Alamo, which was not fully defended as the Texas Army had left to continue its offensive elsewhere. The Mexican Army was able to kill the 189 defenders, but in doing so they suffered far more casualties than they inflicted, weakening the already limited Mexican forces. After the capture of the Alamo, the Spanish Army turned to recapture a fort near the city of Goliad. There, more than 400 Texans were captured. What the Texans likely did not know was that Santa Anna's Congress had passed a law in December of 1835 that stated that armed foreigners taken into combat be treated as pirates, and pirates were executed. The commander of the fort where the prisoners were held wrote in his diary, quote, that he wished to elude these orders as far as possible without compromising my personal responsibility. He then left the fortification and had a subordinate do the dirty work. Between 425 and 445 Texans were marched from the Mexican fort where they were being held in 3 columns, believing they were being sent to gather wood and supplies. They were ordered to turn away from the Mexican soldiers, who then shot them at point-blank range. Those not killed in the volley were beaten and stabbed to death, with the exception of about 28 who managed to fake death and later escape. Those wounded and unable to march were killed in their beds inside the chapel fortification. These 2 events removed any hope of a peaceful negotiation between the Texans and Mexicans. The delegates representing 21 Texas municipalities met in 1836 to declare independence and start working on a constitution, now modeled not on Mexico, but on the United States. However, that constitution will be modified in that it allowed soldiers to be housed and goods to be taken by them as needed, something forbidden by the Third Amendment of the Constitution, and by making explicit the legality of slavery. Hearing of the Mexican massacres at the Alamo and Goliad, recruitment rose dramatically for the Texas Army. Whether because he underestimated his opponents or simply because of poor planning, Santa Anna camped his army in a very vulnerable position. One of his commanders would later say, quote, the camping ground of His Excellency's selection was, in all respects, against military rules. Any youngster would have done better. His troops were attacked and forced to retreat, and in the retreat, Santa Anna was captured. After his capture, he was forced to send an order that sent Mexican reinforcements back, and eventually, Mexican troops fully retreated out of Texas with the intention of regrouping and returning, but never doing so. Although many in Texas called for Santa Anna's execution, he was eventually sent back to Mexico in June of 1836. By that point, he had already been removed from office, and the stories of his brutality were widely reported in the Mexican press. But he was eventually able to restore much of his reputation, following a skirmish with the French in 1838 that came to be known as the Pastry War. But Mexico failing to hold its own territory, and the subsequent creation of the Texas Republic, created a great deal of interest in replication throughout the Southwest. California's missions had been given over to private land known as the ranchos, but like in Texas, they were relatively sparsely populated and lightly defended due to the weakness of the Mexican state. Following Texas being formally annexed in 1845, the next logical step toward the goal of manifest destiny, that being the belief that America was destined to reach the Pacific, was seen as viable, as the opposition was not a great European power, but Mexico, a country which had 40 different changes of leadership in just 27 years. Many believed war is imminent when James Polk won the presidency, given much of his campaign was around the idea of westward expansion. Polk sent a representative to Mexico in 1846 to try to negotiate a purchase, offering $25 million for Mexico to recognize the Texas border at the Rio Grande and Alta, California. But Mexico was in no position to negotiate anything, even if there was popular support, as in 1846 alone the presidency had changed hands 4 separate times. And as before, ambitious American settlers began to move into the largely undefended territory of Mexico, in Alta, California. In the winter of 1845, future presidential candidate John C. Fremont and a group of Americans came to Alta, California under the pretense of buying supplies for a trip to Oregon. In reality, the group had been sent by the War Department to survey the area in preparation for a future likely war. Fremont's group arrived in the Salinas Valley near what is now Santa Cruz. Mexican officials were concerned. Fremont claimed he was looking for a place for his mother to live, but the Mexicans didn't believe the story and ordered him to leave. Instead of leaving, Fremont and his men built a small fort atop a mountaintop overlooking the valley. After a 4-day standoff in March of 1846, Fremont and his men retreated toward Sacramento, where they encountered some Americans who had settled in that area and that claimed Native Americans camping near the Sacramento River were planning an attack on them. Fremont found a large camp of Native Americans near what is now Redding, California, and had his men surround them on 3 sides, with the 4th side being the river itself, giving the group, which was mainly women and children, no place to flee. A member of Fremont's expedition named Thomas Breckinridge wrote, quote, "The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none." Fremont's men were armed with rifles that far exceeded the range of bow and arrow of the Native Americans. Breckinridge said of the massacre, quote, "The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. There were no reported casualties for Fremont's men. Among the group was a man by the name of Kit Carson, who had become kind of a frontier legend about whom a number of films were made, and for whom several states still have celebrations for. Carson described the event by saying, quote, "It was a perfect butchery." Estimates are between 150 and 300 Native Americans were killed. Breckinridge wrote, quote, "I think that I hate an Indian as badly as anybody, and have as good a reason to hate them, but I don't think that I could have assisted in that slaughter. It takes two to fight, or quarrel, but in that case, there was but one side fighting and the other side trying to escape." Fremont and his men continued upriver. Another member of the group, Thomas S. Martin, stated of the event, quote, "We followed up the Sacramento River, killing plenty of game and an occasional Indian. Of the latter, we made it a rule to spare none of the bucks." While all of this was going on, an American warship was moved into Monterey Bay, eventually moving up to the San Francisco Bay, likely to meet up with Fremont's men, who were now moving back in that direction. Some men who had come with Fremont raided a Spanish garrison, stealing around 170 horses, which they took to Fremont's camp. When reports of Mexican troops coming to the area to address the issue emerged, some local settlers decided to gather to seize a lightly manned Mexican fortification in Sonoma. On arrival, the group of 30 men encountered no resistance as they approached. They knocked on the door of the commander's fort, who met with the group and surrendered without a shot being fired. 6 men took prisoners from the fort to Fremont, and the rest remained at the barracks, where they created and raised a flag with a bear on it. This became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. Using the weapons there, a group of settlers armed themselves and waited for Fremont to come and support them. The likely plan was for California to declare independence, as Texas had before, as a prelude to joining the United States. But what the men didn't know was that the United States was already at war with Mexico, after skirmishes on the Texas border started in late April of 1836, with Congress formally declaring war on May 13th. Mexico was only able to convince 7 of their 19 states to send troops or supplies, as they were also facing internal power struggles. Mexican politician Lucas Alamas wrote, quote, "Money spent on arming Mexican troops merely enabled them to fight each other and give the illusion that the country possessed any army for its defense." Ulysses S. Grant's first combat experience came during the Mexican-American War. He wrote in his memoir of the experience, quote, "The Mexican army of that day was hardly an organization. The private soldier was picked from the lower class of the inhabitants when wanted. His consent was not asked. He was poorly clothed, worse fed, and seldom paid. He was turned adrift when no longer wanted. The officers of the lower grades were but little superior to the men. With all this said, I have seen brave stands by some of these men as I have ever seen made by soldiers." By January of 1847, Mexico City was occupied by U.S. forces, and Mexico was forced to concede Alta California. The following year, the Treaty of Guadalupe was signed. It set the border of Texas and conceded what was at that time approximately 55% of the total land of the Mexican state to the United States. This land included what is now California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, as well as the majority of Colorado and a small piece of Wyoming. Mexicans who lived on these lands had the option to stay and become full citizens of the United States, or to leave and go back to what was left of Mexico. About 90% stayed and became U.S. citizens. But citizenship isn't always the same as acceptance. When gold was discovered in California shortly after the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, a gold rush ensued that brought an estimated 300,000 new settlers, so many that California was able to meet the population threshold to become a state in 1850. This large influx of settlers came not just from across the country, but all over the world. However, the new political authorities of the state were open, unapologetic advocates for white supremacy. The first governor of California was a man by the name of Peter Hardiment Burnett, who had been part of the Oregon legislature that had passed racial exclusion laws which forbade, quote, "any Negro or mulatto to enter into or reside in that state" in 1849. He moved to California for the gold rush and was elected governor 2 years later. He pushed for similar racial exclusion laws in California and advocated for, quote, "a war of extermination against native peoples." It was in this context that on the 4th of July, 1851, in the mining town of Downeyville, that a miner by the name of Frederick Cannon was out drinking with friends when he reportedly drunkenly stumbled into the doorway of a Mexican couple's small home. That night, his friends reportedly pulled him out of the home quickly and took him home, but Cannon came back the next day, reportedly to apologize. An argument ensued, and at some point the woman of the home, who was a Mexican, stabbed and killed Cannon. A mob of Cannon's friends soon came to the home to invoke, quote, "miner's law, a life for a life." The woman was put on trial the next day. Some reports say a lawyer who attempted to defend her was beaten and removed from the stand, and the physician who argued she was unfit to be hanged was run out of town. As she was taken to the gallows, witnesses report the woman defiantly said, "I would do the same again if I was so provoked." One account of a miner who lived in the area described the execution this way, quote, "Juanita went calmly to her death. She wore a Panama hat, and after mounting the platform she removed it, tossed it to a friend in the crowd, whose name was Oregon, with the remark, Adios, amigo. Then she adjusted the noose on her own neck, raised her long, loose tresses carefully in order to fit the rope firmly in its place, and then, with a smile and a wave of her hand to the bloodthirsty crowd present, she stepped calmly from the plank into eternity. Singularly enough, her body rests side by side in the cemetery on the hill with that of the man whose life she had taken. She was the first, and is still the only, woman executed by the California government. In 1854, the United States purchased about 29,000 square miles along the New Mexico and Arizona border for $10 million to allow the building of a transcontinental railroad in what is now known as the Gadsden Purchase. While all of these wars and purchases changed the land ownership from Mexico to America, for most intents and purposes, there was no border that prevented migration. In fact, the United States welcomed Mexican workers, particularly in seasonal agriculture and work on railway projects. And this was all the status quo for most of the next 60 years until around 1910, when an internal war broke out in Mexico that created a large number of refugees seeking to escape and move north. But those seeking to escape violence in Mexico were now finding it in the United States. In 1910, a Mexican man named Antonio Rodriguez was accused of murdering a white man near Rock Spring, Texas. A mob dragged him from his jail cell and burned him alive. A year later, a 14-year-old named Antonio Gomez was accused of murdering a German man. He was lynched while he was being transported by police, and his family was driven by the area with death threats. Sometimes the fighting in Mexico would spill across the border. In 1915, there were reported 30 or so border raids that killed an estimated 21 white settlers in the area. Likely in response, between August of 1915 and June of 1916, between 100 and 300 murders of Mexicans occurred on the border. Later investigations discovered the majority of these murders were all conducted by the Texas Rangers. One white Texan at the time reported, quote, "All the Rangers had was to get a suspicion on somebody, any little thing, and they would take him out, shoot him down." Even successful Mexican Americans were not immune to Texas Ranger violence. In 1915, Jesus Pazan and Antonio Lagora went to a Texas Ranger by the name of Henry Ransom to report they had been victims of an armed robbery, losing horses and supplies. Ransom listened to their stories and then shot them and ordered other Texas Rangers to leave the bodies where they fell as a warning. In 1918, a group of Texas Rangers surrounded the village of Portivare, taking 15 men and boys out of their homes at 2 in the morning as part of an investigation of a cattle raid nearby. Despite finding only 2 weapons in the entire village, one of which was in the home of a white settler, the 15 men, all ethnically Mexican, were shot in cold blood, their bodies left in a field. In the days that followed, the roughly 140 people living in that village fled, many to Mexico, and soon after the entire village was razed by the Rangers. Investigations in the years that followed occurred in Congress and estimated that total between 300 and 5,000 ethnic Mexicans were killed by the Rangers between 1914 and 1919. In 1917, in Bisbee, Arizona, a group of mostly Mexican-American miners went on strike. The owner of the mine convinced the local sheriff to deputize a posse of around 2,200 men to break the strike. A local paper wrote, quote, "A sheriff's posse of 1,200 men in Bisbee and 1,000 men in Douglas, all loyal Americans, for the purpose of arresting on the charges of vagrancy, treason, and of being disturbers of the peace of Cochise County, all those strange men who have congregated here from other parts and sections for the purpose of harassing and intimidating all men who desire to pursue their daily toil." Not only were the 1,300 involved in the strike arrested, but anyone seen as supporting the strike was also added to the removal list. In total, around 12,000 people were arrested and brought at gunpoint to the Bisbee post office, and then force-marched 2 miles to a local baseball field. The local sheriff was a man by the name of Harry Wheeler. He reportedly oversaw all of this from a car outfitted with a loaded, belt-fed machine gun. At the baseball field, the 2,000 men were given the option of denouncing the strike. 700 agreed, and the 1,300 remaining were forced into 23 train cattle cars and sent nearly 200 miles away to Hermanas, Mexico. The sheriff continued to report in the months that followed, leading to an investigation by the Arizona Attorney General. When the sheriff was asked by what law the sheriff was acting on, Wheeler responded, quote, "I have no statute that I had in mind. Perhaps everything I did wasn't legal. It became a question of, are you American or are you not?" He went on to tell the Attorney General, quote, "I would repeat the operation any time I find my people endangered by a mob composed of 80% aliens and enemies of my government." The case went to the Supreme Court, where in an 8-1 decision, the court found that the federal government could not act against the sheriff. They ruled, quote, "The court necessarily assumed the continued possession by the states of the reserved power to deal with free residence, ingress, and egress." Therefore, the court believed no federal law had been violated. Yet as all of this was occurring, and anti-immigration laws were being passed against Asians and Southern Europeans, particularly Italians, Mexican immigration was still generally exempted from immigration quotas due to the need for migrant labor, particularly in seasonal farm labor. When in 1917 a literacy requirement was added for other immigrants, a specific exception was made for Mexicans because of the dependence on migrant labor. But when the Great Depression began in 1929, there was no longer a labor shortage, and a repatriation movement arose to remove Mexicans and Mexican Americans from the United States. Over the decade between 1929 and 1939, estimates are between 300,000 and 2 million ethnic Mexicans were deported, expelled, or repatriated from the United States. Of those, an estimated between 40 and 60% were U.S. citizens. The majority of these expulsions occurred between 1929 and 1933 as the Hoover administration scapegoated Mexican Americans for the economic collapse. But the policy continued even after Hoover left office during the Roosevelt administration. In Los Angeles, law enforcement would raid public places in Mexican communities and herd people into trains and buses. At times, the police would block off all exits in a community in East Los Angeles and drive through the community with sirens blaring, rounding up hundreds of people. A local radio reporter described, quote, "women crying in the streets when not finding their husbands after deportation sweeps." In 1936, the governor of Colorado, Ed Johnson, declared martial law, stating, quote, "the entering of alien and indigent people into the state in such large numbers constitutes an invasion that will create, encourage, and cause a condition of lawlessness." Citizens put up signs saying, quote, "warning to all Mexicans and other aliens to leave the state of Colorado by order of Colorado state vigilantes." While the claim was only toward those coming to Colorado from Mexico, in practice this targeted anyone who spoke Spanish or appeared to be Latino. Up until this time, Mexican children hadn't been generally subject to the same segregation as black children, but starting in the 1940s, a number of school districts began creating what they claimed were very special language-separated schools. But in practice, they segregated Mexican children away from white children regardless of language. In June of 1943, a series of riots took place in Los Angeles that became known as the Zoot riots. Whites, mainly servicemen, would attack and strip Latino teens and young men seen wearing outfits called Zoot suits, ostensibly because the outfits required a large amount of fabric, but almost invariably, those were also the outfits popular with Mexicans and other minority groups. A witness account stated, quote, "marching through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, a mob of several thousand soldiers, sailors, and civilians proceeded to beat up every Zoot suiter they could find. Pushing its way into the important motion picture theaters, the mob ordered the management to turn on the house lights, and then ran up and down the aisles, dragging Mexicans out of their seats. Streetcars were halted while Mexicans and some Filipinos and Negroes were jerked from their seats, pushed into the streets, and beaten with a sadistic frenzy." A week after the riots, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote, quote, "the question goes deeper than just suits. It is a racial protest. I have been worried for a long time about the Mexican racial situation. It is a problem with roots going a long way back, and we do not always face these problems as we should." But this was around the same time that labor surpluses became labor shortages due to World War II. In 1942, the United States government set up a program called the Bracero Program, Bracero meaning manual labor in Spanish. This program, working in collaboration with the Mexican government, offered guest worker contracts to 5 million Mexicans, and it was the largest such program in American history. And of course, the 5 million who were involved in that program were just those who came through legal processes. Officials often looked the other way during harvest season when farmers needed additional labor and Mexican laborers were paid under the table. Even after the war, the agreement between the two countries was extended, and in 1951 it was dramatically expanded at the request of Western farmers, not just in the Southwest, but also in the Northwest. But both the Mexican and the American government were concerned about the number of migrants who failed to return to Mexico. Mexico itself was also experiencing labor shortages, particularly farm labor shortages. An estimated 70% of those who applied to migrate legally were denied access to the program, but most would simply go anyway, with or without the Bracero program, if they could find access to farms. Even with World War II still raging, border guard numbers were increased. In 1945, the United States began deporting deeper into Mexico in hopes that there would be a deterrent, but that had little success. In 1954, the Mexican government added 5,000 border guards in an effort to keep labor in Mexico that wasn't going through the negotiated Bracero program. And in that same year, President Eisenhower requested an executive order to mobilize the military to execute mass deportations. Those who crossed illegally often did so by swimming across the Rio Grande, leading them to call the racial slur Wetback. Their slur became the name of the deportation program, Operation Wetback. In the first year of the program, the Border Patrol reported over 1 million people were forced to return to Mexico. They reported that in Texas alone, 500,000 had been sent. For context, there were under 8.4 million people living in Texas at that time. Those deported by U.S. officials were then given to Mexican officials in central Mexico, where Mexico had the labor shortages, in the hopes that the distance from the border would prevent return. About 11,000 filed complaints showing that they were actually part of the Bracero program and therefore were deported illegally. Others deported were found to be U.S. citizens. But all of this did little to actually stop the migratory flow, as seasonal migratory labor was built into the culture and economics of the region. The following year, the Border Patrol reported only deporting 242,000, and that number continued to decline for many years until the program was eventually defunded. By the time it was done, they had reported that 1.5 million had been deported, but most suspect that many of these were repeats, sometimes 3 or 4 time repeats. Also inflating the numbers were the fact that many of those who were counted were actually self-returns, going back based on seasonal labor cycles. In the first 30 days of the program, 60,000 of the roughly 120,000 counted by the government actually left voluntarily, many if not most returning later either to the Bracero Program or just following seasonal work patterns. Many were actually taken to the border and just told to complete the Bracero paperwork, then immediately allowed to return. Some Bracero contacts began adding language indicating, quote, pre-designated return, that would allow them to skip the process each growing season as they were already approved in the prior year so long as they came to work for the same farmer, creating a kind of indentured servitude specifically to farms for specific workers they wanted to work legally. Many historians have argued that the mass deportations had nothing to do with decreasing the amount of Mexicans living and working in the United States. The same year the mass deportations began, the size of the Bracero program expanded from 201,000 in 1953 to over 300,000 in 1954 and to almost 400,000 in 1955. At its peak, there were 436,000 Braceros, meaning the number had more than doubled in the same period they were executing mass deportations. Therefore, the goal was to make sure those involved in labor had few options for who they worked for and how much they were paid, more than preventing anyone from coming across the border. In 1964, the Bracero program was ended following years of accusations of abuse and wage theft from Mexicans in the program, as well as protests in the United Farm Workers Union that the Braceros were using as scabs to break strikes. In 1965, likely in an effort to fill the gap closed by the Bracero program, the Department of Labor and Department of Agriculture teamed up to create a summer jobs program, calling itself the A-Team. This stood for Athletes in Temporary Employment as Agricultural Manpower. 18,100 teens signed up, but only 3,300 ever actually made it to work in the fields. A teen involved in the program described the first day by saying, quote, "The wind is in your hair and you don't think it's bad. Then you go out to the field and the first ray of sun comes at the horizon. The first ray. Everyone looked at each other and said, 'What did we do?' The thermometer went up like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. By 9 a.m., it was 110 degrees. Of the 3,300, 200 quit within the first 2 weeks. Others staged strikes to protest the conditions. One teen in the program was quoted as saying, quote, 'We worked 3 days and all of us are broke.' The program ended after just one summer. History is awkward.